Margaret Calloway arrived at work the same way she always did, 15 minutes early, a small coffee in her left hand, her badge already clipped to her scrub top. She walked through the side entrance of Riverside General Hospital, the way she had walked everywhere for the past 8 years, with a slight lean to the right, her left leg moving just a little slower than the right, her chin level, her eyes forward. Most people who saw her for the first time looked at that walk twice. Some looked away politely, others did not bother to hide their curiosity, and a few, a small, unfortunate few, decided that a limp was something worth making jokes about. Maggie had learned, long ago, not to waste energy on people like that. She had learned something far more important in a dusty field in Kandahar province, Afghanistan, at the age of 26, that the body keeps going long after the mind tells it to stop, and that the only thing that truly matters, in any moment, is the person in front of you who needs help. She had grown up in rural Kentucky, the only child of a woman who cleaned offices at night and waitressed on weekends. There was never much money, but there was always a sense of purpose in their small home. The idea that a person's worth had nothing to do with what they owned and everything to do with what they gave. When Maggie enlisted in the U.S. Army at 19, her mother had held both her hands at the kitchen table and said, "Whatever you do over there, you make sure the people around you know they're not alone." She served 2 tours as a combat medic and was known among her unit for being completely calm in moments that terrified everyone else. While other people froze, Maggie moved. She had a quiet confidence that her fellow soldiers described as reassuring. Not loud, not showy, just steady. The kind of steady that made people believe things were going to be okay, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. On a Tuesday morning in her second tour, that steadiness was tested in a way that changed the rest of her life. A convoy traveling a route they had used many times before struck a hidden explosive device on the road's edge. The explosion was sudden and total. When the smoke began to clear, 3 soldiers were down and in serious condition. Maggie, who had been riding further back in the convoy, was already moving before the dust had settled. What she did not yet fully realize was that a piece of metal from the blast had torn through her left leg. She felt pain, a sharp and burning kind, but she cataloged it the way she had been trained to and kept moving. She reached the first soldier and began working, then the second, then the third. She called out instructions to the other medic on her team, her voice steady, her hands certain. She did not stop until all 3 men had been stabilized. When the evacuation team arrived and finally reached her, she was sitting on the ground with her back against a vehicle, still giving instructions. She had been working for 40 minutes on a leg that, it turned out, had a fractured femur and shrapnel embedded near her knee. She was awarded the Army Commendation Medal. The citation described her actions in careful military language, but the colonel who presented it to her in the hospital said something simpler. "You saved their lives, specialist, at the cost of your own comfort, and possibly much more. This country owes you a great deal." Maggie thanked him and asked how her 3 soldiers were doing. That was the only thing she wanted to know. 18 months of rehabilitation followed. The surgeons did what they could, and what they could do was considerable, but the leg was permanently changed. She would walk with a limp for the rest of her life. She was told this plainly, and she received it plainly. Then she enrolled in nursing school and completed her degree in 2.5 years, sometimes attending classes on crutches, sometimes on a cane, eventually on neither. She applied to Riverside General and was hired without hesitation. Her references described her as exceptional. Her interview panel used the word remarkable twice. What no one at Riverside General knew, because she never told them, was any of this. The medals were in a shoebox under her bed at home. Her service record was her own business. She had come to do a job, and the job was all that mattered. For 3 years, she did that job with everything she had. Her patient satisfaction scores were consistently the highest in the intensive care unit. Families of patients wrote letters describing the way she sat with people in the difficult hours, the way she explained things clearly and calmly, the way she seemed to understand fear in a way that made it smaller. A man who had been admitted following a serious heart event told his wife that the nurse with the quiet walk had made him feel, for the first time since he arrived, that he was going to make it. None of this was visible to Dr. Harlan Voss. Dr. Voss was a cardiologist of 52, who had spent 3 decades building a reputation for precision and speed, and a certain kind of brilliance that he wore like a coat he never took off. He ran the ICU rounds with the confidence of a man who had never seriously questioned his own judgment. He was not a cruel person in any deliberate sense. He was, instead, the more common kind of careless, the kind that never considers whether its small casual words land on someone else like stones. His first comment about Maggie's walk came during a busy morning round, delivered sideways to a resident with a short laugh. The resident laughed too. Others nearby either smiled or looked at the floor. Maggie was at the other end of the corridor and did not hear it, but 2 nurses did. Neither of them said anything. They needed their jobs. Over the following months, the comments became a pattern. Never anything dramatic. Never anything that a person could point to clearly and say, "This is wrong." Just small remarks. The kind that collect quietly inside a person over time. "Can we pick up the pace, team?" said with a glance in Maggie's direction. "We need people who can move quickly in this unit," said to a group that included her. A junior resident once repeated one of the doctor's remarks to a colleague in the break room, thinking it was funny, not realizing that a nurse named Priya was sitting just around the corner of the counter with her lunch and her silence. Maggie was aware of all of it. She was not oblivious. She had been paying attention to people her whole life. She simply made a choice that she had learned to make under considerably worse conditions. She kept working. She told herself, on the days it stung the most, that the patients in those rooms had no idea any of this was happening, and that they were the reason she came through that door every morning. She told herself this on the morning of the Tuesday, when Commander James Whitfield was admitted. He arrived following emergency spinal surgery, the result of an injury sustained during a military training exercise at a nearby base. He was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with gray at his temples, and the kind of focused, watchful eyes that suggested he had spent years in places where being unaware of your surroundings was something you could not afford. He was in pain. He was also, unmistakably, completely in control of himself. Maggie was assigned as his nurse for the shift. She entered his room the way she entered every room, efficiently, attentively, checked his monitors, reviewed his chart, adjusted his medication line, and made a note in his file. She did all of this without unnecessary conversation, because she had learned that some patients needed talk, and some needed quiet, and this one, she could tell immediately, was the second kind. She was nearly at the door when he spoke. "What branch?" 2 words, no explanation, the question of one person who already knew the answer to another. Maggie stopped. She turned just enough to look at him directly. "Army," she said. "Combat medic. 2 tours." He nodded once. She left. That afternoon, Commander Whitfield asked his aide to find out what was available on the nurse assigned to his care. He did not explain why. He did not need to. An hour later, his aide returned with a printed document, not a personnel file, but a military service record. The aide placed it on the bedside table without comment and stepped out. Whitfield read it slowly. He read the description of the convoy incident. He read the medical notes about the fractured femur and the shrapnel. He read the words of the citation, "Demonstrated uncommon valor and complete disregard for personal safety in the performance of her duties." He set the document down and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he understood the walk. He had seen that specific compensation pattern before, in people who had been through blast injuries, who had rebuilt their movement from the ground up through sheer will. He had simply not known, until now, where hers had come from. The next morning was a Wednesday, and Wednesdays at Riverside General were the days of combined rounds, the weekly gathering where the attending physicians, residents, charge nurses, and floor nurses all moved through the ICU corridor together, reviewing patients, sharing notes, and occasionally, in certain dynamics, reinforcing the unspoken order of things. Dr. Voss was leading, as usual. The group moved along the hallway in a loose cluster, clipboards and tablets in hand. Maggie was at the back edge of the group, as she often was, close enough to contribute, far enough to avoid the space where the casual remarks tended to land. Dr. Voss made a comment. It was the same kind of comment he had made before, a remark about pace, about efficiency, about keeping things moving, and it came with the same sideways glance. A few people laughed softly. Priya, the junior doctor, stared at her tablet. Two nurses found something very interesting to look at on the wall. From room 7, a voice came clearly through the open door. "Nurse Calloway, could you come here, please?" The voice was calm and entirely without request. It was the voice of someone who had spent decades speaking in a way that left no room for anything other than compliance, not from fear, but from the absolute certainty of the speaker's authority. The hallway quieted. Maggie excused herself from the group and stepped into the room. What happened next took no more than 90 seconds, but those who witnessed it from the doorway and the corridor described it, in the months and years that followed, as one of the most affecting things they had ever seen in that building. Commander James Whitfield, in his hospital gown, connected to monitors that tracked the recovery of a repaired spine, pushed himself carefully to the edge of his bed and stood up. He was clearly in pain. He stood anyway. He straightened his back as much as he could, and then he raised his right hand to his forehead in a sharp, formal, complete military salute. He held it. He spoke loudly enough for the corridor to hear. Specialist Calloway worked on 3 critically wounded soldiers in the field under active enemy fire. She had a fractured femur and metal in her leg, and she did not stop. She was still giving instructions to the next medic when they carried her out. "I have had the honor of serving alongside some of the finest people this country has ever produced." He paused. "I have never been more honored to be cared for by anyone in my life." He lowered his hand. He sat back down. He said nothing more. In the corridor, no one moved. Dr. Voss stood with his clipboard at his side, his face showing something that was not quite shame and not quite recognition, but was somewhere in the territory between the two. Priya was not bothering to hide the fact that she was crying. The charge nurse said afterward that the silence lasted a long time, long enough that it stopped feeling like a pause and started feeling like an answer. Maggie looked at Commander Whitfield for a moment. "You should rest," she said quietly. "You need it." Then she walked back into the corridor, past the still group, and continued her rounds. She did not cry. She did not stop. She went to check on the patient in room 4, who had been asking for an extra blanket since the night before, and had not gotten one yet. In the weeks that followed, things changed at Riverside General. Not all at once, and not perfectly, but genuinely. Complaints that had been sitting in drawers were reopened. A review of the ward's internal culture was initiated. Priya submitted a written account of what she had witnessed over 3 years, and it was taken seriously for the first time. The citation from Maggie's service record was posted on the staff board with her permission, after a colleague asked her privately and she said yes with a small shrug. Dr. Voss wrote her a letter. It was private, not public. It was also, by most measures, honest. Maggie read it, thanked him briefly when she next saw him, and moved on. She was not in the business of holding things. On the day Commander Whitfield was discharged, he asked a nurse at the station to find Maggie. She appeared a few minutes later, her badge slightly crooked from a busy shift, her coffee long since finished. He held out his hand. She shook it, and it was not the polite handshake of a patient thanking a nurse. It was the grip of one person to another person who had both been somewhere difficult and come back from it carrying the evidence. "Thank you for your service," he said, "both times." She smiled, a small, real smile, the kind that does not need to be performed. Then she went back to work. Margaret Calloway still works the ICU at Riverside General. Her patient scores are still the highest in the unit. She still arrives 15 minutes early. She still walks the way she walks. That steady, slightly uneven rhythm that she carries without apology or explanation. And if you ask her about any of it, the convoy, the medals, the morning in the corridor, she will most likely tell you that she was just doing her job. She will mean it completely. That, perhaps, is the most remarkable thing of all.